In this episode, we're going to practice a skill that separates mature security thinking from anxious guessing, which is assessing threats based on likelihood and impact rather than reacting to headlines, social media panic, or dramatic worst-case stories. When you are brand new to cybersecurity, it is easy to feel like every new threat is the most dangerous one, especially when the technology is unfamiliar and the language around AI can sound mysterious. The truth is that most organizations do not fail because they ignored a mythical super attack, but because they missed a common, realistic risk that was quietly growing in their own environment. Likelihood and impact give you a way to compare threats fairly, to choose priorities you can defend, and to focus your effort where it reduces real harm. By the end, you should be able to explain what likelihood and impact mean in AI security, how to estimate them without pretending you have perfect data, and how this approach helps you avoid both overreaction and complacency. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Threat assessment is the process of evaluating potential harmful events so you can decide what to address first and how strong your defenses should be. Beginners sometimes confuse threat assessment with predicting the future, but it is not fortune-telling. It is structured reasoning under uncertainty. You take what you know about the system, about how people use it, and about the environment around it. Then you judge how probable certain abuse cases are and how damaging they would be. This matters because time and resources are limited, and a security program that tries to do everything at once often ends up doing nothing well. For AI systems, this discipline is especially important because there are many possible misuse patterns, many possible integration failures, and many ways for data and outputs to travel. When you assess threats through likelihood and impact, you move from fear-based choices to evidence-guided choices, which is what keeps risk management stable. Likelihood means how probable it is that a specific threat scenario will occur in your context within a reasonable period of time. The critical beginner insight is that likelihood is not a universal score for the entire world. It changes based on who can access your system, what data is exposed, and how strong your controls and monitoring are. A public-facing AI chatbot will have a different likelihood profile than an internal tool used by a small trained group. A system connected to sensitive data sources will have different likelihood than one that only uses public information. A system with weak access controls and weak monitoring will have higher likelihood than a system with strict access boundaries and strong detection. Likelihood also changes over time as usage grows, features expand, and attackers learn what is possible. The goal is to estimate likelihood honestly, using the best available evidence, not to make it look low to avoid work. Impact means how bad the consequences would be if the threat scenario actually happens, and impact also depends on context. In security, impact can include harm to individuals, such as privacy violations or unsafe guidance, and it can include harm to the organization, such as financial loss, legal exposure, operational disruption, and damage to reputation and trust. For AI systems, impact often includes integrity harm, meaning wrong outputs lead to wrong decisions, and those wrong decisions may create downstream harm even when no data is stolen. Impact can also be amplified by scale, meaning the same failure affects many users quickly, or the same unsafe output is repeated across channels. Beginners should also notice that impact includes recovery cost, because an incident that requires shutting down a major service for days is a high-impact event even if direct data exposure is limited. A careful impact estimate considers who is affected, what data or actions are involved, and how hard it would be to contain and recover. When you measure impact clearly, you avoid letting flashy threat descriptions distract you from the consequences that truly matter. To assess AI threats without hype, you need to break broad, scary ideas into specific scenarios that can be evaluated. A scenario is a clear statement like an attacker uses repeated prompts to extract restricted information from a system connected to internal documents, or a malicious document is ingested into a retrieval source and causes prompt injection that bypasses policy checks. Specific scenarios have a who, a how, and a harm. Once you have that, You can ask evidence-based questions about likelihood, such as how exposed is the interface, how often do we see probing behavior, and how strong are our controls at the data access boundary. You can then ask evidence-based questions about impact, such as what data could be exposed, whether outputs could trigger actions, and how widely the system is used. Beginners often try to assess threats at the buzzword level, like prompt injection is scary, but that is not actionable. Actionable assessment requires turning buzzwords into scenarios you can reason about. A helpful way to estimate likelihood is to consider attacker opportunity, attacker capability, and system exposure. Opportunity includes how easy it is for someone to interact with the system, such as whether it is public, whether it is behind authentication, and whether access is monitored. Capability includes how skilled the attacker needs to be, because some threats require advanced knowledge while others require only persistence. Exposure includes what the system can reach, such as sensitive data sources, downstream actions, or privilege tools. For example, if a system is publicly accessible and has weak rate limits, the likelihood of probing and abuse is typically higher because the opportunity is high and the barrier is low. If a system is internal but accessible to many accounts, the likelihood may still be significant because compromised accounts are a common reality. If a system is isolated and only uses public data, the likelihood of high-impact data theft may be lower, though other threats like reputation damage may remain. The point is to use these factors to ground your estimate instead of assuming all threats are equally likely. Another practical approach is to look for historical indicators, even if you are new and do not have years of data. Indicators can include how often similar systems have been misused in your environment, how often users accidentally enter sensitive data, how often policy violations are detected, and how often vendors experience outages or changes. If you see many near misses, like blocked prompts that suggest probing, that increases likelihood estimates for abuse cases involving extraction attempts. If you see frequent configuration mistakes and drift issues, that increases likelihood estimates for integrity and reliability threats. If you have a history of weak access governance or poor change control, that increases likelihood estimates for insider misuse or accidental exposure. Beginners should understand that even small data points are useful when they are interpreted carefully. The goal is not precise math, but honest calibration that reflects the reality of what your organization tends to struggle with. Estimating impact also becomes clearer when you consider the system's role and the sensitivity of its inputs and outputs. If the AI system can access regulated personal data, a confidentiality incident can carry high legal and trust impact. If the AI system influences decisions that affect people's rights or opportunities, integrity failures can be high impact even without any attacker. If the AI system sends outputs to customers or publishes content, harmful outputs can create immediate reputation impact and potential harm to users. If the AI system triggers automated actions, impact increases because the system can cause real-world change quickly. Beginners should also consider the difficulty of remediation, because a system that has spread incorrect information widely can be hard to correct even after the root cause is fixed. Impact assessment is strongest when it describes concrete consequences rather than abstract severity. When you can say who is harmed, what is harmed, and what it would take to fix, you are assessing impact in a way leaders can understand. An important part of avoiding hype is recognizing that high impact does not automatically mean high priority if likelihood is very low, and high likelihood does not automatically mean top priority if impact is minimal. The real priority often comes from threats that are both likely and impactful, and those are often not the most dramatic sounding. For example, accidental sensitive data entry into prompts can be highly likely in many environments, and if logs or outputs expose that data, impact can be significant, making it a high priority. Vendor outages may be moderately likely and can have high operational impact if critical functions depend on the vendor, making continuity planning important. Some highly advanced model extraction attacks might be lower likelihood in a tightly controlled internal system, though they could be high impact for a public product that relies on proprietary models. Beginners should learn to resist the temptation to chase the most exotic threat because it feels sophisticated. Sophistication does not equal priority, and the likelihood and impact lens keeps you honest. Another reason this approach matters is that it helps you communicate decisions without sounding emotional or dismissive. When someone says we must address this scary AI threat immediately, you can respond by asking what is the likelihood in our environment and what is the impact if it happens. Then you can compare it to other threats using the same scale. This changes the conversation from fear versus denial into reasoning versus reasoning. It also helps avoid a different failure mode where teams become numb to threats because there are too many alarming stories. A structured assessment framework creates calm because it gives the team a consistent way to decide. For beginners, communication is part of security work because if you cannot explain why you chose one priority over another, you will be pulled in random directions by whoever is loudest. Likelihood and impact provide the language for disciplined prioritization. It is also valuable to acknowledge uncertainty explicitly because pretending certainty is a form of hype in itself. You may not know the exact frequency of a certain abuse case, and you may not know the full impact until you map dependencies, but you can still make a reasonable estimate and plan to improve it over time. This is where monitoring and metrics connect directly to threat assessment, because good monitoring reduces uncertainty by showing what is actually happening. If you start tracking blocked prompts, policy violations, unusual access patterns, and data leakage indicators, you can refine your likelihood estimates based on real signals. If you track what data sources are connected and what outputs are delivered where, you can refine your impact estimates because you understand exposure pathways better. Beginners should see that assessment is not a one-time judgment. It is a living estimate that improves as evidence improves. This is how you avoid being trapped by either fear or ignorance. Another practical piece is understanding that controls change both likelihood and impact. So threat assessment is not separate from mitigation planning. If you add strong access controls and narrow data retrieval, you can reduce likelihood of extraction abuse cases and reduce impact if misuse occurs. If you improve content filtering and output review for high-risk channels, you can reduce impact of harmful content incidents even if some attempts succeed. If you implement rate limiting and monitoring, you can reduce likelihood of automated abuse and detect it faster. If you design degraded modes for outages, you reduce impact of vendor failures by keeping essential functions running safely. Threat assessment guides which controls are worth investing in, and controls in turn reshape the threat landscape. Beginners should understand that the goal is not to identify threats and feel helpless, but to identify threats and then change the system so those threats are less likely to succeed and less harmful if they do. Finally, assessing threats without hype means staying grounded in the organization's mission and risk appetite. A system that supports low-stakes internal drafting might accept some degree of output variability while focusing more on data handling risk. A system that supports critical decision-making must be far more conservative about integrity risk, even if that slows deployment. A system that is public-facing must be more conservative about reputation and harmful content risk, even if data exposure is limited. These differences are not contradictions. They are context-driven trade-offs. When you align threat assessment with what the organization is trying to achieve and what it cannot afford to lose, your priorities make sense and remain stable over time. Beginners often feel pressure to treat all AI threats as existential, but mature security thinking is about proportionality. Proportionality is what enables business opportunities safely, because it keeps effort focused where it matters most. As we close, assessing AI threats by likelihood and impact gives you a disciplined way to choose priorities without being pulled around by hype, fear, or exotic worst-case narratives. Likelihood asks how probable a scenario is in your environment, given exposure, controls, and historical indicators, while impact asks how damaging the consequences would be for people, data, operations, and trust. Turning buzzwords into specific scenarios makes assessment actionable, and recognizing uncertainty keeps you honest and adaptable. This approach also improves communication because you can explain decisions as evidence-guided trade-offs rather than emotional reactions. As you build monitoring and learn more about your systems, your estimates become more accurate, and your controls can be tuned to reduce both likelihood and impact. When you practice this mindset, AI security becomes calmer, more credible, and more effective, which is exactly what Domain 2 is trying to teach you to do under real pressure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.